All right, we only have an hour together, at least for now, so I'm going to get going. And I think from the comments, people are already making some of the questions that are underway. I think folks are probably on the same page, concerned about a lot of similar things. So let me set the stage a little bit, just to give some context, and then I think we'll hop right into things. So to state the obvious, this is an extraordinarily challenging time for everyone. You see already people making comments about how do they get their kids to do, much less embrace, online learning. Teachers are being thrust into a completely different world. Adults, parents are working from home while trying to manage the kids, just trying to keep everybody sane. And again, that's not even to mention trying to get people to focus on their schoolwork in this new reality. So it's an enormously challenging time. And that's really the genesis of this community chat, is that we've heard a lot from people in our community that this work, that collaborative problem solving, can be really helpful to people at this time. So we wanted to create some forums for us all to get together and share resources and thoughts and support each other as well, because obviously this is just such a disconnected time. So for us all to get together like this, I think is really important in and of itself. So you know, as I mentioned, incredibly challenging time for everybody, but even worse for kids with challenging behavior. Because as you all know, kids with challenging behavior struggle with skills that they need to meet people's expectations when things are going decently. But when you add enormous stress, which is what the case is right now, you know, we are just an extraordinarily dysregulated society right now, and there's incredible rates of dysregulation in our homes. And so you take kids who struggle with these skills and then you add enormous stress and dysregulation for them and for their caretakers. And all of a sudden, things are much, much worse. And, you know, I think it also needs to be said that many kids who struggle with challenging behavior struggle with skills related to flexibility. And of course, what's happening right now is just an enormous demand for all of us to be incredibly flexible, because we're having to reshape our personal and professional lives entirely on a moment's notice, and really importantly, against our will. These are largely changes that we really didn't want to have to make. So, you know, dysregulation is contagious. We're all really dysregulated now. So I think the first most important thing to just set context here is to remember the philosophy behind collaborative problem solving. People do well if they can. Kids do well if they can. Parents do well if they can. Teachers do well if they can. There's got to be a lot of challenging behavior going around right now, and not just from the kids. And it's really important for us all to remember that none of us are behaving badly on purpose, okay? So even the best of skills goes out the window when you're under enormous stress like this. And as I mentioned, if skills were weak to begin with, it's even worse. They'll be nowhere to be found right now. So first, we need to have compassion for ourselves, our colleagues, our partners, our spouses, and our children as we think about how to navigate this. Now, the good news, I would say, is that I do think collaborative problem solving can be helpful to people. And it's interesting how the more stressed you are, the harder it is to stay true to something that may have been helping you previously. So part of my hope for this community chat is for us to really return to some of the major tenets of the model, and particularly to think about how they can be applied right here and right now in some of these particularly challenging moments. So let me take a pause here and see what questions and comments we have coming in from people. Let me kick off the sort of practical piece of this by saying, all right, the first thing that we like to think about in collaborative problem solving when it comes to challenging behavior is, are the expectations clear and realistic for a child? And I think it's particularly important right now to rethink our expectations. Because first of all, a lot of these expectations are going to be completely new. I mean, we have to establish entirely new expectations for ourselves and for our kids. So even before thinking about how do you troubleshoot when somebody isn't doing something you want them to do, I'd encourage everybody to step back and say, all right, is it realistic? Is it feasible, these expectations? And then really importantly is, are they clear? Because we need to first really establish them and teach them to our kids. What are we expecting of them? What are we hoping for from them? But I think we can take a page from teachers' books here. Teachers, particularly of early childhood education, elementary school teachers, ones who really practice what we call sort of pro-social teaching and foster a pro-social environment. One of the things they're great at is involving kids in establishing those expectations. In other words, not just sort of having them come down from on high to the kids and hoping they're going to meet them, but actually have a discussion with the kids about how are we going to handle this new reality? And what kinds of expectations should we have of each other? You know, for instance, I see a tremendous amount on social media and flying around the internet of sample schedules that have been created that could be helpful. And I will tell you that part of me thinks, wow, this is great that people are sharing these things. And the other part of me thinks, oh my gosh, this is going to be a disaster when parents all of a sudden become sort of homeschoolers and are trying to impose a schedule on these kids. And some of these kids, by the way, are really going to appreciate a schedule because they like to know what's expected of them. However, they really need to be co-authors of these schedules. So I would say the first order of business is examining your expectations, having a discussion with your kids about coming up with those expectations together and making sure that they're crystal clear. And of course, the other thing I would say about this is this doesn't just apply to kids in our homes as parents. This applies to teachers who are now trying to teach entirely using distance learning. It's time for a reset of expectations together. All right. Yeah, so that Katie had asked this question, which is suggestion for parents in terms of establishing a new daily schedule. You know, Katie, you'll have in mind some things that you need to have be a part of the schedule. Those are what we would call in collaborative problem solving your concerns, things that have to be addressed. But I would enlist your kids in discussing a schedule with them in terms of what can be accomplished in the amount of time you have and what's going to seem reasonable to them. If they are co-creating that with you, they're going to be just so much more invested in it. So make sure that they're authors of that schedule together. I had anticipated a big question that we're going to want to address is siblings who are fighting with each other, because the reality is that siblings squabble a lot to begin with, even when you don't have one or more kids in the home who struggle with particular skills like flexibility and frustration tolerance and problem solving. But that's actually when kids are usually not under each other's noses all day long. So now you take kids, they're not able to get out and blow off steam. They're cooped up, and they're cooped up together. And probably trying to figure out how to share the same types of things that everybody wants to do and have access to. So, the short answer of how you do that, Katie, is you do what we call group Plan B. Plan B, of course, for those who know this approach well, is code for collaborative problem solving. But I think what's really important with sibling B is that you aren't actually one of the problem solvers as the parent. As the parent, your job is to actually sit the kids down and have a discussion about a problem that you're seeing. Remember, this is a basic tenet of collaborative problem solving. Don't problem solve the fighting. Okay, that's the challenging behavior. What you want to do is you want to identify some of the antecedents to that behavior. In other words, some of the things that they are fighting over. Okay, is it who gets to watch Netflix on the big TV? Is it, it could be any number of different things. Pick specific antecedents, specific triggers, and try to address those proactively. Okay, so you're going to sit them down. You're going to bring up not the behavior, you guys fighting all the time, but the thing they seem to be struggling with together, and tell them you just want to really hear both of them out. And just do a lot of active listening. You just hear from one of them, hear from another. If it's 3 siblings, like in my household, you hear from another. And I think the most powerful part of sibling plan B is when you step back. It's when you as parent actually, believe it or not, step out of it a little bit. Because siblings are typically so used to seeing parents play sort of, the buck stops here role of saying what's going to happen and dictating it. And when you can step back and say, all right, so I've heard you, I've heard you. What do you guys think you can do about this? And that's the really important phrase. What do you guys think you can do about this? And you can quickly add, I'm here to help. I can help you guys, but it sounds like this is something you guys are going to need to work out together, because we're going to be at this for a long time. So y'all are going to be wanting to watch your different Netflix shows at the same time. What do you think you can do about it? Any ideas? So again, the theme that I'm trying to hit here pretty hard is authorship and ownership. And it's interesting. I just posted something on my Twitter about this, because a little video, because what I was trying to do for people is review. There's additional benefits to this besides kids just being really invested in the solutions that they come up with. It's actually where kids get to practice a lot of skills. And when you look at what motivates kids, it's autonomy, it's buy-in, it's feeling some sense of mastery. And if they're just on the receiving end of solutions like this, solutions to problems like this, they don't get that stuff. So engaging them heavily in the process is what I would suggest. Let me address the question about, for teachers and behavior interventionists, what can you do to help support students at home, particularly in this very uncertain environment with expectations that might not be clear? And your question shows you know exactly what you should be doing. You say, would it be beneficial to bring the parent into the conversation about creating expectations at home, or is that a boundary we should cross or not? I think you got to cross it. I actually wouldn't think of it as boundary. In this time, you're teaching kids while they're in their homes. So it inherently is a collaboration. I mean, it reminds me of advice I give when they're homework problems. I think parents solving a homework problem or teachers solving a homework problem on their own is pretty limiting, because the homework's assigned at school but done at home. And it could break down both in terms of what's being assigned at school or how hard it is to complete at home. So the best way to solve homework problems is always collaboration. And in this case, I think it's even more that is true. Of course, the challenge is it's pretty hard now, but yeah, you can hop on Facebook or rather FaceTime or Zoom, or just make a phone call or reach out to a parent. And ideally, that conversation would involve your student, parent or parents, the adult caretakers at home, and you discussing what might be getting in the way and how you all could be helpful. Yeah, so for instance, I was mentioning access to Netflix. Linda's bringing up a great example of access to a computer so that you can do the work. And that's a great example of limited resources. You've got a problem to solve. Best way to do that, of course, is to engage the kids directly in that problem-solving process. Yeah, and so, Lisa's question, you hear a child who's saying they cannot be away from school so long, and they simply can't do it, and obviously there's no choice. She's stuck there. What do you do to help? And, in collaborative problem-solving language, you might be inclined to say to yourself there, well, they can't go to school, right? So this has to be what we call plan A. We have to impose our will. We cannot let them go to school. But I actually think, of course, they're pretty clear about that. I think what you want to be doing is you want to be doing what I call plan B after inheriting plan A. The world has dealt plan A, and you're not allowed to go to school, but I'm here to help to figure out what we can do about that. And the fact that she's saying she cannot be away from school so long, that is really a concern that needs a lot of drilling down on. So what I would do is I do a lot of reassurance. Okay, I hear you. I hear you. You're saying that you cannot be away from school that long, and you're just not going to be able to do it. So I really want to understand what it is about being away from school that feels so overwhelming. And by the way, she may bark at you and say, it doesn't feel it is. And you say, okay, it is. Sorry, I misspoke. Okay, it's really overwhelming. Help me understand, because there might be so many things that is overwhelming about it. And for me, this is a big theme right now, is that there's a lot of talk about how to talk to kids about what's going on and how to handle it. There's not a lot of talk about how to listen to kids. And for instance, one kid who can't handle the fact that they're not going to go to school, her concerns are going to be very different than another kid's concerns. Their concerns might be, one might be academic, one might be social. There's all kinds of different things. And we really are not going to know what kind of solutions might be possible until we drill down on those concerns. And so, you obviously feel stuck if the only solution to the problem is that she's able to go back to school, and you can't do that. You're totally stuck. If we drill down on what's so hard about this, we may be able to come up with some solutions that are not ideal, but that could address some of her concerns. Linda's also commenting on how this might be more difficult for one child in the house that doesn't have anybody. You have siblings. Well, you have people to hang around with, spend time with, play with, but you can also fight with them. Don't have siblings, less people to fight with, but less people to do things with as well, unfortunately. There's a bunch of comments. I'm seeing themes across multiple people's comments about if a child won't talk to you at all, if they're really being aggressive or unsafe, risky, but they won't talk about it at all. And obviously, those kinds of questions are a bit challenging to answer in a vacuum without a whole bunch of other information, without being able to talk it through directly. But I do have, a couple of thoughts. One thought is, to go back to what I said before in the beginning, this is such a challenging, scary, stressful time for everybody, kids included, that's going to come out in all kinds of ways. And I would be careful that if most of your approaches to a child are to try to get them to collaborate, get them to problem solve, get them to talk about their concerns, all the things that I'm talking about, and they're clamming up, it may be too much for them. It may literally be too much. So in that case, you really have two different options. One option is to not go there, and instead to try to focus on what kinds of relational interactions can you have that aren't around problems at all, that aren't around trying to get them to meet your expectations, but are simply trying to spend some time together in the same space. And you've just got to work really hard to bite your tongue if they seem to be going with you, and avoid thinking, oh great, now they're interacting, now is where I'm going to pounce and try to start this problem solving thing. You might just need to be spending some time together to regulate them enough to where they can get to the point of being able to talk to you. I think the other thing you can do is what I often refer to as doing plan B about plan B, which is, let's say you're trying to problem solve and they won't talk at all. I will often make that the problem to solve. In other words, saying, hey, you know what? I've noticed that when I'm trying to talk to you about stuff like the online school stuff and everything, you don't even want to talk. Don't worry. I'm not going to force you to talk right now about the online school or anything like that. Okay, I'm not going to force you to talk about that. I guess it just would help me to understand a little bit about why it's feeling like not a good idea to talk about any of this right now, or why it feels like too much. Maybe if you can just tell me a little bit about that, but we don't have to talk about any particular problem, okay? So that you can see in collaborative problem solving language, that's a lot of reassurance I'm giving, that I'm not going to force a problem solving conversation, and yet I'm trying to understand what is it that feels so overwhelming right now. All right. So many great questions. I can barely keep up with them, but Daisy's helping triage as well for me here. So let me just take a little time here. I'll just quickly address, how to handle attention-seeking behavior, because, sort of common advice for attention-seeking behavior, if it's negative behavior, is to ignore that behavior so that you don't reinforce it. I don't personally subscribe to that view, because my feeling is kids do well if they can. That if a kid could seek attention in a more adaptive way, they would. And that if they're not, well, they're struggling to figure out a better way to communicate a need for attention and connection. And so, I would probably bring that up with them And if that's too much of a dose of sort of intimacy for them, too dysregulating for them, just figure out ways that you can give them attention, and don't for the moment say to yourself, well, I'm reinforcing that challenging behavior. No, they're doing the best they can under very, very difficult circumstances. I talked about siblings a little bit ago. There's a question about how to engage a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. Believe it or not, Nicole, you can do it with a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old. It's obviously more challenging. You're going to scaffold it a whole lot more. So you're not going to do a ton of drilling down. So you're going to have a more active role, and probably for the 4-year-old in particular. But when we've studied this, what we've really seen is that a neurotypically developing 3-year-old with an adult's assistance can let you know their basic concerns, what's bothering them on a basic level, and can engage in some basic problem solving. So I'd encourage you to follow the blueprint that I laid out before, just knowing that you're going to be taking a more active role. So simple strategies for people who don't know CPS, which is a great question. And let me go real simple now, okay? And I actually think this is helpful for everybody. It's helpful for me. I've been doing some media interviews and things, and people don't want to hear about collaborative problem solving. They want to hear in 30 seconds, how do you help? What do you do? And sometimes it's really helpful to back up. And what I say to people is, okay, first of all, remember, nobody's behaving badly on purpose. You're going to need to make new expectations, make them together, as we talked about. But what we haven't gotten into yet is, once you establish those new expectations, give them a couple of days and see what doesn't work. And then decide to have and this is how you're going to explain this to a family that doesn't know collaborative problem solving. You're going to sit down, not when those problems are happening, but outside the moment, and have a proactive discussion. And the most important thing is, you're going to ask the kids first what they think about the problem, what's going on for them, what's hard for them. You're not going to ask them about their behavior, just about the situation that isn't going well. And once you hear from them, then you're going to explain to them what you're worried about. And once you hear where they're coming from and what you're worried about, you're then going to invite them to try to come up with solutions that work for the both of you all for tomorrow, when it's time to fill in the blank with the basic expectation. Now, notice I didn't talk about plans A, B, C, or anything like that, but I just gave a little primer on collaborative problem solving. Interesting question with a child with school refusal before this pandemic, and how to help with the transition. I actually would be fascinated to know, some of the kids I've worked with school refusal issues, actually distance learning would address many of their concerns. And so they actually might be in better shape. But you may be asking, Lauren, about the transition back after. I'm not sure about that. It really depends on the particular reasons for a kid's school refusal, whether those are going to translate, of course, into distance learning as well. Thanks, Chris, for your comment about listening being overlooked. Let me just add that I actually think it's not fair to tell people simply to leave them at make sure you listen, because listening is actually a whole lot harder than we give it credit for. People think that sort of listening is this passive thing, but that phrase active listening is really true. And this is where, again, without getting into all the ins and outs of collaborative problem solving and plan B and the ingredients, you can remind people of what we call the drilling tools, because in essence, they're things that help you listen. And it's not rocket science, right? You can say to people, the best way to listen is ask a lot of questions. And if somebody's answering your questions, reflect back to them what you've heard. Like, say it in your own words, and check with them and say, am I hearing you right? Is this what you're saying? So a lot of questions and reflective listen. Reflect what you hear. Of course, what people are going to say is, but what if they don't answer the questions? And then what you say to them is, well, you take a guess. Are they not answering the questions because they don't know how to answer the questions? Or are they not answering the questions because they're suspicious of this whole thing and don't trust the process or you just yet? Because if it's the former, that they actually don't know how to answer it, then what you do is educated guesses. And just tell people it's like playing a game of 20 questions, although you often don't get 20, you might get 5 questions, so use them wisely. If you think, however, it's not that they don't know, it's that they're scared, worried, don't want to fill you in, then you run with reassurance. And here I'm very clear with people. When we say reassurance, what I really mean is you're trying to reassure them that you want to understand their perspective or their point of view, and that you're not wanting to impose your will. So it's the statements we suggest, like, I'm not trying to make you, or I'm not saying no, or I'm not saying you have to. I just want to understand. Another one of my sort of go-tos for me personally, besides I just want to understand, is I know there must be an important reason that, and you can fill in that blank. I know there must be an important reason that you haven't been logging on to Zoom when your teachers have asked you to. Don't worry, you're not in trouble. Reassurance. I know there's got to be an important reason. I really just want to understand. And so you can teach people that active listening is those four things. Questions, reflect what you've heard. If they're not answering, try guesses or try reassurance, and just toggle back and forth between those four things. Yeah, gosh. Jen Aldrich, hi there, up in Vermont. Jen, I saw you on Zoom during our certified community meeting, and I have to say I was envious of your fireplace roaring in the back. That was regulating for me. But Jen is a principal in Vermont and a long-standing CPS expert. We go way back as well, back to her days in the North Shore of Massachusetts in the schools. She's asking me to share thoughts about realistic expectations and the balance between meeting the social emotional needs of our students and the academic concerns. And man, is that a big and important question. And I personally believe that, as I mentioned before, everybody is so hugely dysregulated right now, and dysregulated kids don't learn, and dysregulated teachers don't teach very effectively either. So I actually think that we need to prioritize the social emotional needs of our kids, and frankly, in schools, of our faculty as well, if we're going to make any progress academically. Now, I say that while also knowing that I'm hearing from some of the kids I work with that actually there's something very comforting about being able to dive into some academic work as well. So, I'm not saying that they should take an entire back seat, but I do think we need to prioritize connection first and foremost for these kids. And some of my favorite things I've been seeing online in social media have been people trying to think about ways to help kids embrace academic concepts through their daily life at home. That actually conversation around those things connects people in a way that everybody I think has been feeling disconnected so far. Sarah is indicating that, I had said that no one's behaving badly on purpose, but sometimes it feels like children just do that. Oh, absolutely it does. And sometimes it feels like adults do that as well. So let's just be clear about that. I actually personally, as I mentioned before, I don't buy the notion that negative attention is better than no attention. Most of the kids that I've gotten to know, and adults for that matter, would prefer to be left alone than have a lot of negative attention. So I just feel like a kid who's behaving badly on a chronic basis, there's more to it. And the basis of our work for 25 years now has been really building, an evidence base that started long before us that showed that kids who do behave badly in a chronic way, they always are the kids who struggle with skills related to problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance. So the notion that they're behaving badly on purpose, to be honest, has been sort of scientifically disproven as well. But in moments of stress, as Sarah's pointing out, we get angry. I mean, look, we're stressed to hell to begin with. Okay, so we're like at our wits' end, and then the kids are too. So then the kids are behaving poorly, which then triggers us, and then we begin to lose it. And it's just the dysregulation amps up. And the more dysregulated we adults get, the more we tend to view challenging behavior as volitional. It's just what happens because, we're not using the smart part of our brain anymore that knows about the research I was just citing. We're responding much lower down in the brain. We're just responding emotionally. And frankly, we don't like to talk about this, especially a group of caring, empathic adults like this, but we get pissed. We get really pissed at our kids when they're behaving this way. And that's where we come to some of those assumptions that might be misconceptions, but they don't feel like it in the moment. Alana, kids who benefit from strict routines, any suggestions for helping them flex to unstructured work demands? Right. So you've got a rigid, concrete, literal black and white thinker on your hands who, when they've got a plan and everything goes according to the plan, they're so much better off. My goodness, this is what I was alluding to in the beginning, why this is such a setup for disaster for these kids, because all of a sudden the routine is completely out the window. And honestly, the other problem is, even if you come up with a really strict routine together, collaboratively with the child, which is what I suggest, and I mentioned that earlier, you just can't run your home like a school. I mean, it's the reality. It's why some of the kids I work with do much better at school than they do at home. It's not that their parents are doing a bad job. It's that the structures and routines of schools tend to serve them very well. And a much overlooked structure and routine, or support, really, I guess I would call it, is the fact that in schools, there's a whole bunch of other kids doing the same thing at the same time. And thank goodness, usually like 85% of those kids are fairly well behaved because they have decent skills. So they're doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're supposed to be doing it. And it's sort of like a school of fish swimming along. They sort of pick up the other ones and drag them along with them at times. So it's just so much harder in a home to be able to enforce strict routines. But I guess, I would go right back, Alana, to be proactive and have that child be co-author in drafting what this routine is going to look like. And they may draft an overly rigid one, and then here comes your opportunity to be what we used to call a surrogate frontal lobe by saying to them, all right, I love this schedule. This is great. I have a couple of thoughts about this. And then you're going to list your concerns. And even if you don't have any concerns whatsoever, you're going to list the concern of, I'm just a little worried about what happens when stuff happens at home that doesn't happen at school that we can't really predict, like fill in the blank. What should our plan be for that? I've worked with a lot of very inflexible kids over the years where they develop these sort of like emergency plans for when something doesn't go according to plan. What are the 3 options that we can do instead? So I'd probably recommend going in that direction, Alana. I'm just seeing some things here randomly. Tina, we're going to plan to offer online training for CPS during the shutdown. Lots of you finally have a bit more time available. We are indeed, and we're going to be coming forth with lots of different things, including we are hoping to have our intensive 2.5-day trainings, believe it or not, chunked up slightly differently, but delivered online. And our team is working incredibly hard to put those together right now. Davina's talking about the concept of letting go is tough for some. It's something I've been talking a lot about in these days. In collaborative problem solving, we've got 3 plans. Once you reset your expectations, you see which ones aren't being met, and you've got 3 options. Try to make the kid do what you want, plan A. Try to collaborate to solve the problem, plan B, or drop it. For now, at least, plan C. I think you need a lot more plan C than you used to have. It's just the time deserves it. You have to prioritize. And I really would just encourage parents and teachers to remember one of our basic teachings about Plan C, and that is that Plan C is not giving in. Okay, giving in is when you're trying to impose your will to solve a problem and you're not able to pull it off. And maybe you're not able to pull it off because you're not even in the same room, teacher, as the kid right now. So you can't pull off Plan A, even if you wanted to, and you end up throwing up your hand saying, okay, fine, forget it, and dropping the expectation. That's not Plan C. That would be a description of giving in. Failed Plan A leading to just throwing up your hands. Plan C is strategic. So I want everybody to remember that when we adults, parents, teachers are choosing to use Plan C, we are still in charge. Okay? It's a strategic choice where we are saying we are deciding for now, not forever, to drop some expectations that used to be important expectations to us. They probably will again in the future, but right now they're not going to be because we've got bigger fish to fry. And I think in a time like this, it's so important. And I know a lot of times parents will Or teachers will be concerned, if I drop it now, will I ever be able to pursue that expectation again? Yes, you will. When life eventually gets back to some form of normalcy again, you'll be able to pursue them. And what's the worst case scenario? A kid doesn't respond so well to you pursuing them again. Well, you've got another option besides plan C and plan A, and that's plan B at that point. Yeah. So Kim, how to navigate close quarters that everybody is experiencing with some strategies for space. I'm just laughing because so I've got 3 kids. I've got a college student, a high schooler, and a middle schooler at this point. And we're like on top of each other because, for instance, like right now I'm in their bedroom because that's my temporary office. And the crazy thing is everybody's got to be online at the same time. All kinds of things are going on. So the space issue is huge, but you're not in it alone. This is a great example of, if you're observing this to be a problem that everybody's suffering from, bring it up proactively, and you actually have a whole bunch of problem solvers that you can put to work here. So you can say, and it doesn't have to be some big family powwow that kids, whenever we announce we're going to have some family meeting, kids are like, oh boy, or worse. It can be more casual, but it can be like, hey, guys, are you all having the same issue I am, where it like feels like we're on top of each other and we can't get out here? What do you think? And don't jump to problem solving. Go around and get everybody's perspectives. And you may be shocked because somebody might be like, oh, I love it. It's great. Okay. But you need to get everybody's perspectives on the table and then throw it out to the group. So what do you think we could do? And I would even ask one of the kids to be scribe and write down all the potential solutions for this space issue. And of course, once you start thinking creatively, like this, is all kinds of things you can do, from rearranging what the space looks like inside temporarily to staging who's where when. But make sure you're not the only person trying to come up with solutions, because you limit the creativity, but also then they feel imposed. And it all goes back to that authorship and ownership thing I was talking about before. Karen Kraut, hi there. How are you? Don't know if you're back from overseas or not, but I haven't seen you in person in a long time. Hope you're well and hope your family's doing okay. She's asking if we consider screen use like any other problem to solve, or because of its addictive nature, do you treat it differently? I don't treat it differently. I just know that sometimes when it gets completely out of control, parents have to use plan A. I mean, there's 3 plans for a reason. Sometimes you have to use plan A, and there's downsides to plan A. Things can get ugly with plan A. It can harm your relationship with plan A, but sometimes you need to do plan A, at least in the short term. Having said that, I think screen time is an issue that you can attack very effectively, and have done this many times with many families using plan B. I think what, of course, is so challenging now is, screen time used to sound like a dirty word to parents, and all of a sudden now, people's whole lives are being conducted almost on screens. And frankly, this is a good example of where I think there's got to be more plan C, because I was talking to a kid I work with. We're doing a Skype session, and I was asking him how disconnected he feels from his friends. And he was like, oh, I don't actually feel that disconnected. I miss school because of that, but I'm still connecting. I was like, oh, that's great. You texting him? You talking to him? He's like, no, we're playing games all the time. And he was on his screen, playing Xbox and other things all the time, but he's playing with his friends and he's talking to them. And to be honest, that's better connection than we're able to get anywhere else outside the home right now. So plan B is possible. Don't forget plan C during this time as well. And this is not to diminish the fact that you certainly don't want to come out of a situation like this with somebody a whole lot more addicted than they used to be. But that would be grist for the mill. That's your concern that you want to raise when doing plan B. You see some good examples, by the way, up here, replying to each other about quiet spaces, things like that. Yeah, the books on the dresser. That's because they're up here because this is my kids' bedroom, and my kids are big fans of the work, and they like to read my books over and over again. In fact, they can't get enough of them. I wish my kids would go on screens because they're usually glued to my books late into the night. No, this was, I had a media interview where they asked me to put them up in the background. Oh boy. Okay. Yeah, and Alana says, Plan C is huge for someone who's 18 years old. Feel like you're running out of time. Let me just say a quick comment there that I know what you mean. If you're running out of time, you sort of want to up the ante on your Plan B, and you don't want to do so much Plan C. I will just caution you and others. I found personally, and with families I work with, that whenever I've tried to sort of speed things up, speed up progress, and race against the clock, I've always regretted it. Because you sort of you can't outpace what sort of development is ready for. And whether that is like, I only have 6 more sessions with them, or a kid's about to go off to middle school or high school or college, and we try to rush and push through things, we almost always forget it. You've got to go at the pace that the kid is at developmentally. Somebody's asking if my kids have ever used Plan B on me. Well, if they did try to use Plan B on me, what I would tell them is you can't use Plan B on me, and you better go back and read more of those books because you have to do Plan B with someone. You can't use Plan B on someone. You can use Plan A on someone, but not B. But all kidding aside, it's funny. I think my kids have used Plan B with me, not formally, but if you run a household where you do a lot of problem solving, kids pick it up. This might make people feel better, but the times that I remember the most are the most humbling, because they used Plan B because I was going all A on them, because I was dysregulated and I was going with A. And I remember my daughter, my youngest, she's about to turn 14 in a few months. She's the middle schooler. I remember when she was younger, one time she looked at me, and when I was like mid meltdown, and she said to me, "Dad, can't we just work this out?" And I was like, oh my gosh. And that actually stopped me in my tracks and got me regulated enough to get back to being a reasonable parent again. So yes, it can happen. Yeah, if your kids do say, "Are you using that stuff on them?" One of the things I love about this approach is that there's no secrets. There's no like secret technique. And so, I've explained to both my own kids and kids that I work with, look, here's what we're doing. There's no secret sauce. Okay, here's what we're doing. We're going to try to listen to you really hard. And once we do, then we actually expect you're going to do the same with us and listen to us real hard. And once we both know where we're coming from, then I'm going to ask you if you have some ideas for what we can do about this that are going to work for both of us. And I really want to hear what you say, because I want to come up with something together. And that's Plan B. That's collaborative problem solving in a nutshell. If you are somebody who's new to this, you're using Plan B flashcards, or maybe you're using a chapter from a book or a handout of ours, or Plan B organizer, something like that. These things you can get on our website. If you're using those things, it's not like you need to be holding them back here and looking at them while you do it. You can show them this thing. Show them exactly what the ingredients of Plan B are. One of my favorite stories was when I was taking a tour of a residential program, and the woman giving me the tour I thought was a staff member, and I was asking her how it was going, and she was saying how much she liked Plan B, but then all of a sudden she said, but sometimes they catch the staff trying to do tricky Plan A and sneak their solutions instead of their concerns on the table. And this was a kid who had learned Plan B and was helping to keep staff honest when they were doing Plan B. And one of the really nice things about the process is that people can't use it against you. Right? As long as your concerns are on the table and you're clear about them, people can't wield the power of Plan B against you. Yeah. So as an educator, can you provide some tips for getting parents engaged in the process? It's a great question. I mean, I can tell you just from my own kids, when I'm getting inundated with emails and they're in 3 different places, as I mentioned, college, high school, middle school, and everybody's going about their distance learning differently. And I got this long email from my daughter's French teacher, who is fantastic, unbelievable. but I was overwhelmed. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm just trying to keep up with my own work in distance learning. I don't know how I can do this. So I think, first off, I would say parents do well if they can. And just like our teachers who are undertaking this enormous task right now, parents are pretty overwhelmed as well. So I would try to keep it short and sweet and use a lot of empathy. My personal feeling is that we need to be crafting some personal reach outs to parents. There's so many community gatherings that are happening live right now. I at least haven't been aware of any live gatherings between educators and parents. And I think that's absolutely critical so that people can get on the same page face to face, because I think it's really hard to do that by reading long, complicated emails that have to do with the new expectations in terms of the distance learning. And I think, unfortunately, what happens often then is that the parents just forward them on to the kids and try to impose them on the kids, and then it gets ugly. Yeah, and I see some comments about, by the way, taking care of yourself, which is absolutely so critical, parents, teachers at this time. And of course, what's so hard is the things that we often do to take care of ourselves, some of which we can't even do. I know, talk about rearranging space. I'm rearranging my dining room most mornings to do, the only other time I've been on Facebook Live is to do live streaming yoga, to just try to regulate myself and take care of myself here. Oh, I love seeing somebody's kid using Plan B with them. Thanks to Dr. Erin Hill, one of our Think Kids staff members. And Karen, I'm glad this is helpful. We are going to be doing these periodically and in different ways. We're thinking of maybe doing some series that are topic specific in this way, but we're trying our best to come up with other ways we can support people. And I'm glad to hear that you are doing okay and still in France there. We've got about 5 minutes left, folks. I'm just going to mention a few sort of random things while I see if some other questions come in here. When we're using collaborative problem solving, we're often wanting to remind people that the model collaborative problem solving isn't just Plan B. That, as I've been talking about, it's being aware that you've got multiple options, Plan A, B, and C, and there's different times to be using each of them. But I'll also suggest at this time not to forget about the assessment process, because we're in a new reality, but challenging behavior tends to be predictable. And after a few days, after a week, whether it's you're trying to get your new routine as a parent or you're doing this distance learning as a teacher, you're going to spot the patterns. You're going to spot where are these difficulties happening, and make sure to make a list of those predictable problems and make them as specific as possible. And that's going to be the jumping off point for then deciding, are you using Plan A, Plan B, Plan C? Oh, okay. Lauren, so advice for families where one or both parents do become ill from COVID. I think my biggest piece of advice, I'm just going to reiterate from earlier, which is be careful to do more listening than talking. I don't know how old the children are in the home, but these days, I'm amazed at how much information kids come by so quickly. And so one of the most important things you want to do is understand how they're making sense of that information, what they know, and what they think and what they feel about it, first and foremost, before you come armed with a whole bunch of information. So this is where you put the first ingredient of Plan B to work for you. And, it is possible to provide reassurance about that everybody's going to be doing everything they can to make sure everybody gets healthy. But the most important thing, first and foremost, is to listen hard to understand how a kid is making sense of this whole thing. And again, I just would remind you, use those 4 drilling tools: questions, guesses, reflective listening, reassurance, to try to understand where they're coming from and what they think. So a kid who's taking an Uber during this crisis, and by the way, not just kids are taking Ubers. I mean, this is part of the reason a lot of state governments are getting to the point of actual quarantines, I think, because people aren't adhering to the social distancing guidelines. I guess what I would say, Anya, and very nice to see you out there as well, is I would say I think of taking an Uber as a solution, a bad solution, to a problem. And so I think what you want to do is you want to try to get to the bottom of that kid's concern. In other words, the reason they want to take an Uber, get that on the table, and then let them know why you're not wild about them taking an Uber, and ask them whether there's some way they could get where they need to get without exposing themselves or others. And that's the kind of problem solving you're going to be wanting to do. A lot of great comments here. Barbara, just very quickly, we're about to run out of time, but defiance, all defiance is a kid struggling to meet somebody's expectations and expressing it in a way that's pretty off-putting and at times obnoxious as well, and even unsafe. But the whole goal with this is not to concentrate on the defiance, but instead to concentrate on what expectations are they defying. And then saying to yourself, which skills are they struggling with that if they either had in more abundance or could apply better at a stressful time like this, they'd handle those situations without being defiant. So use our assessment and planning tool to shift away from a focus on the challenging behavior, defiance, to instead focus on what are they defying and the why, the lagging skills. And kids who say they aren't doing things just because they don't want to, frankly, I'm suspicious. Because if they were doing things before, was that because they really wanted to now and now really don't? I think it's probably more complicated. What I would do is I would say something like this. If a kid says, I just don't want to, I go, stick with the model. I go right with reflective listening. Got it. Okay. So you don't want to. I guess I'm just curious why you don't want to. Don't worry, I'm not going to try to make you want to. If you don't want to, I get it. But I'm curious why, because I bet you have some good reasons why you don't want to. And if they did want to before, I'd ask them what's shifted for them right now. Yes, Rosa, people are reaching out so that we can make sure there's a way for you to follow up and get some resources after this as well. I realize it's 3 o'clock. I know people have all kinds of things to attend to as we have focused on today. I really want to thank everybody for joining us. It looks like this has been helpful, but please give us more feedback so that we can know if it indeed was, what we could do to make it more helpful. We're trying our best to create resources and support and ways to connect with everybody. So please be in touch and let us know how we can do that most effectively. It is really great to have everybody together. I loved seeing old friends and colleagues and connections from all over the world, really, from recent past and long ago. Be safe, folks. Stay in touch with everyone. And really thank you for spreading the word about this approach that's particularly needed in a time like this. And I would say sort of parting comment is, remember the philosophy. People do well if they can. Kids, parents, teachers, ourselves, we're all doing the best we can with the skills we have to handle an enormously difficult situation. So thank you all very much, and we'll be in touch and hope to see you soon. Thank you.